The microphone crackled as Mitch McConnell leaned forward, his words dropping like ice. "You're simply unqualified." The insult sliced through the chamber like broken glass across marble. For a moment, even the cameras seemed to flinch, their lenses tightening in on the smirk that lingered at the corner of his mouth. The fluorescent lights above flickered, casting the room in a pale, merciless glow. In that instant, the Senate floor transformed from a chamber of governance into an arena of spectacle. Gasps fluttered like trapped birds along the back row. A few aides scribbled frantically in their notepads, their pens scratching as though history itself was being etched in real time. McConnell leaned back, satisfied, his silence thicker than the words he had just uttered. He thought the line was final. He thought the blow had landed. Across from him sat Jasmine Crockett, her posture unshaken. The insult hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting, yet she refused to break eye contact. Her hands rested calmly, fingers interlaced, as if holding back the tremor of an earthquake. The room grew deadly quiet. Even the faint hum of the air conditioner seemed to vanish, replaced by a silence that pressed down on every chest in the chamber. Viewers at home felt it too, the sting of dismissal, the audacity of arrogance. They knew what the word unqualified really meant in the mouths of men who had built fortresses of power to keep others out. Outrage surged like an undercurrent, rising in the throats of those who had fought too hard to be told they didn't belong. Yet Jasmine did not rush to fill the silence. She let it linger, let it grow, until it no longer belonged to McConnell but to her. A hush fell like snowfall. The camera held on her steady hands. Every breath seemed to count. And in that pause, in that fragile, suspended silence, the balance of power shifted, though no one realized it yet. But what looked like a knockout blow was only the spark that would ignite something larger. This wasn't just a committee meeting, it was a crucible where reputations and futures were forged. The chamber itself seemed aware of the weight pressing against its walls. Behind McConnell's words stood decades of dominance, a career carved from patience, alliances, and ruthless calculation. His grip on the Senate was not just procedural, it was symbolic, the embodiment of an old guard that guarded its gates like fortress walls. Each dismissive phrase he uttered carried more than insult, it carried history, tradition, and the power of exclusion. And opposite him sat Jasmine Crockett, a woman still rising, still being measured by cameras, critics, and constituents alike. Every move she made, every pause, every glance would be studied, dissected, replayed. To some, she was already a beacon, a voice unafraid to confront injustice head-on. To others, she was a target, her presence itself seen as an intrusion into the spaces long dominated by men who had convinced themselves they were gatekeepers of qualification. The air thickened with unspoken stakes. This was no longer about a single exchange of words. It was about who gets to define worth in American politics. It was about the centuries-old narrative that authority belongs to those who look, sound, and act a certain way. Crockett, by simply being there, was rewriting the script. McConnell's words were meant to snatch back the pen. The camera pans wider, revealing the arena. Journalists shifted in their seats, sensing that this moment was bigger than the docket on paper. Across the country, screens flickered, carrying the insult into living rooms, offices, and coffee shops. People felt the sting of it, not only those who had faced the same dismissal, but those who understood what it meant for democracy itself. For Crockett, the burden was heavier still. She knew she carried more than her own reputation. She carried the silent expectations of those who had been told, no, too many times, of those whose credentials were questioned, whose belonging was always provisional. And that made every second of silence after McConnell's insult pulse with dangerous meaning. Suspense curled in the chamber like smoke. Would she falter under the weight? Would she answer with fire or with silence? Every option had its risks. But the anticipation made one truth inescapable. This duel was no longer just between two senators. It was between entrenched power and fresh moral clarity. The past leaned into the present. For those watching, this was not only about who would win the exchange, but what kind of voices would shape the nation's future. To understand why McConnell's words cut so deeply, We need to step back into his shadowed past. For decades, McConnell's name was synonymous with power, but also with the slow suffocation of those who dared to rise. His career was not built on fiery speeches or soaring visions. It was constructed brick by brick in the corridors of strategy, where silence could be sharper than any word and patience was weaponized into dominance. He perfected the art of delay, obstruction, and quiet dismissal, wielding procedure like a sword sheathed in velvet. While others chased headlines, he amassed influence. While others fell to scandal or ambition, he endured, watching rivals crumble and allies fade, leaving him the unmoved figure at the center of the storm. The halls echo with old footsteps. McConnell walked them not as a servant of the people but as the custodian of power itself. Committee hearings bent to his rhythm, debates were throttled by his grip, and votes often froze under his cold calculation. To face him was not simply to face a man, it was to face a system honed to perfection, a fortress built out of rules, tradition, and his unyielding will. His dismissals were legendary. Opponents described the way his eyes would glaze, as though their words were background noise unworthy of acknowledgement. For him, belittling was not an accident, it was a tactic. Reduce your adversary to a footnote, and you never need to meet them as an equal. Time and again, rising figures, especially women, especially people of color, found themselves on the receiving end of that subtle, almost casual disdain. It was never shouted. It was never messy. It was quiet, deliberate, suffocating. And that was his genius. Intimidation cloaked in procedure. Disdain disguised as tradition. A shadow stretched long over the Senate floor, reminding every newcomer that before their first words were spoken, their place had already been decided. Yet there was irony in this iron grip. His strength was also his fear. To dismiss was easier than to debate, to block was safer than to build. His power thrived on preventing change, not creating it. The weight of history pressed down on him, yes, but it also trapped him, chaining him to the very tactics that made him feared. For every opponent suffocated, another would rise, and with each rising figure, the cracks in his armor widened. His insult toward Jasmine Crockett was not the first of its kind, it was the repetition of an old song, one sung to countless challengers who stepped into his arena. But this time, the stage was different. This time, the cameras were sharper, the audience broader, and the hunger for authenticity greater. His shadow was long, but it stretched toward twilight. Because in the silence after his words, something dangerous to him began to stir. The room that had so often bent to his gravity suddenly seemed to lean in another direction. Yet against that towering shadow, a new voice began to emerge, steady, unshaken, and unafraid. Jasmine Crockett's story didn't begin under the lights of the Senate, it began in the quiet grind of a courtroom, where truth was her only weapon. Long before her name reached headlines, she was poring over case files under dim lamps, memorizing statutes, and preparing for battles where the odds tilted steeply against her. She wasn't born into the halls of power. She earned her way forward through persistence, grit, and the unshakable conviction that justice, even when delayed, could still be claimed. The grind of years echoes in her silence. Each client she represented was more than a name. They were people up against systems designed to forget them. In the courtroom, she discovered a truth that would guide her: calm was not weakness. Patience was not passivity. A steady voice, grounded in fact, could dismantle arrogance louder than any shout. And so, trial after trial, she sharpened that weapon, not fire, but clarity. She carried scars too. The early days of her legal career were not without humiliation. Judges cut her off mid-sentence. Opposing counsels underestimated her. She walked into rooms where her presence was a surprise, sometimes even treated as a disruption. And yet, each dismissal hardened her resolve rather than erasing it. Every time someone doubted her, she answered not with anger but with proof, with preparation, with unrelenting persistence. The camera lingers on her journey's milestones. She won cases others called impossible. She stood for clients others abandoned. Her work was not glamorous, it was grueling, but it carved into her the habit of standing steady while storms raged. Her rise into public service was a natural extension of that calling. What she had practiced in the courtroom, lifting voices otherwise silenced, became the mission she carried into politics. She was never the loudest in the room, but she was often the one who made silence impossible to ignore. She was not there to be ornamental, not there to play the role of token. She was there to remind power that truth had a face, a name, and a calm that could not be broken. Barriers followed her into politics, too. Whispers that she lacked the experience, necessary backhanded comments that reduced her achievements to appearances. But the same resilience that carried her through cross-examinations carried her through campaigns and debates. The grit she learned in courtrooms, where every objection, every sigh, every roll that tried to knock her off balance, now anchored her in the political arena. And yet, through it all, she remained grounded. Family, community, the countless people she represented before ever holding office, they were the roots that steadied her. Pride was not in titles but in service. Authority wasn't about holding the gavel. It was about standing up when others couldn't. Every trial was training for this moment. The patience, the restraint, the discipline to wait until arrogance exhausted itself, these were habits born long before she walked into the Senate chamber. Each courtroom silence taught her that words could be deadlier when they arrived measured, not rushed. Each victory reinforced that strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it simply refuses to bow. So when Mitch McConnell's insult rang out, dismissing her with the chill of power that had silenced so many before, Crockett already knew her weapon. She had wielded it for years. Calm was not retreat. It was strategy. It was power. And so when insult finally struck, her answer had been forged long before. Every barb he threw landed harder, but she did not flinch. Instead, her calm grew sharper. The debate sharpened like steel. McConnell leaned forward, the weight of decades behind every syllable, his tone dripping with condescension. He was not merely speaking, he was rehearsing a ritual he had mastered, the slow dismantling of challengers with words honed to wound. Unqualified, he repeated, each utterance like a gavel meant to end the discussion before it truly began. Each word left scars. The committee room, under its harsh fluorescent lights, seemed to shrink into a boxing ring where the imbalance was palpable, an elder statesman wielding power like a weapon, a rising figure forced into defense. Cameras tightened their focus, capturing not only the smirk across his face but the silence across hers. But silence was not surrender. Crockett's stillness radiated something more dangerous than rebuttal: patience. She listened as he doubled down, piling layers of dismissal, questioning her record, minimizing her work, framing her presence as accident rather than earned, verify source before publish. His words carried the weight of tradition, as though history itself had handed him authority to decide who belonged. The crowd leaned closer. Members shifted in their chairs. Staffers glanced at each other, wondering if they were watching another routine dismantling, or something else entirely. The imbalance of tone grew starker with every exchange, his voice loud, his gestures dismissive, his cadence sharpened with arrogance. Hers, by contrast, was steady, almost unnervingly so. Tension thickened. McConnell pressed harder, his rhythm quickening as if racing to corner her before she could speak. He threw out legal jargon, citations, anecdotes meant to mock rather than enlighten. His attacks, meant to overwhelm, instead revealed the desperation beneath the control. Crockett did not rise to meet his heat with heat. Instead, she remained composed, her hands folded, her eyes fixed, her presence unshaken. Every breath seemed to count, measured even. The patience was not weakness but calculation. She was letting him build the very pedestal from which his own arrogance would topple. What frustrated the room was the mismatch. The senator's tone was fire, meant to scorch. But against calm logic, fire consumes itself. The audience sensed it. The longer she held her silence, the more his barbs began to echo hollow, bouncing off walls instead of cutting deep. Frustration mounted, not in her, but in him. His words grew repetitive, circling the same insult as though louder repetition could make it true. His hand struck the table once, his jaw tightened, his breath shortened. And still, she did not move. The imbalance became undeniable, power against patience, noise against poise. Anticipation filled the room like static before a storm. Reporters adjusted their pens, lenses trained closer. The silence between his words stretched, waiting for the inevitable, the moment she would finally break it. And then came the moment she chose to strike. Her voice was steady, but each word cut like glass against stone. For a beat, the chamber held its breath. The hush was not empty, it was full of years, of hearings, of those who had been told they didn't belong. Her words arrived measured, deliberate, surgical. She did not rise to the bait. She did not match the voice that had tried to drown her with volume. Instead, she offered evidence, a life of work, courtroom victories, and a record of service that could not be dismissed with a single sentence. She began not with outrage but with fact. She named cases she had argued, principles she had defended, clients whose lives she had changed through painstaking legal work. Each detail landed like a coin on marble, impossible to ignore. With quiet authority she mapped the through line of her career, study, service, and stewardship, the steady accumulation of competence that outlived gossip and sarcasm. Qualification is not a whisper reserved for those already crowned, she said, her tone unmarred by bitterness. It is proven in work, in results, and in the courage to stand for people who are often left out. She dismantled the rhetorical scaffolding of dismissal. Where he had offered a caricature of lack, she supplied the ledger. Years in courtrooms where she held power to account, legislative fights where she defended the vulnerable, and a record of lifting voices that otherwise slipped between the cracks of policy. Each assertion was careful, not boastful, but rock solid. The camera cut to reaction shots, a young staffer mouthing the word, "Wow!" An older senator blinking slowly, recalculating. The air seemed to split open. Members of the committee could not help but listen, the room that had been bending toward his cadence now tilted toward hers. Her syllables had the weight of a gavel. Every syllable landed like a gavel. She spoke to the broader truth, that, unqualified, had long been a code word for keeping doors closed. She tied that word to a history many in the audience knew too well, the history of gatekeeping cloaked as judgment, of standards applied selectively to exclude. Her voice threaded those stories together without fury. Instead, she offered a mirror. If qualification is defined by who is already in power, she said, then it is not a standard, it is an inheritance. As she spoke, the style of the exchange shifted. What had been an attempt to shame her turned into a public accounting. Her calm became a counterweapon, measured evidence that neutralized bluster. Where he tried to land blows, she returned context. Where he had tried to reduce her to a punchline, she reassembled her life, clear, durable, and undeniable. Then she pivoted to principle, sweeping from the personal to the civic. She reminded the chamber that service is not a privilege reserved for the few but a responsibility to the many, a reminder that democracy thrives when barriers fall, not when talent is policed by pedigree. The line was not a flourish, it was a line drawn in the sand. Her cadence remained unhurried. The slow rhythm made the points land harder. There were pauses, deep, strategic, where the silence itself seemed to emphasize the truths she just placed in the air. People in the room felt the shift. Pride swelled among observers who had long watched their own qualifications questioned. For immigrant communities, for working families, for those whose competence had been doubted because of accent, appearance, or upbringing, her words were a validation. Then, with the softest inflection, almost casual in its finality, she delivered the clincher, a concise, undeniable distillation of her record and a refusal to accept a definition that excluded. If you think my presence here is a mistake, she said, then look again at the lives I've served. Silence followed. But it was not the blank silence of defeat, it was the stunned hush of a verdict delivered. The sound seemed to echo differently now, as if the chamber itself had shifted its balance. Cameras captured the faces across the aisle, the tightness around jaws, the quick breaths that spoke of a recalculation taking place. The debate that had been lopsided for so long now felt balanced by gravity. Outside, the first ripples began. Reporters who had expected a routine exchange stopped typing, rewrote leads, and send out the first clips. Social feeds, the ever-attentive mirror to public mood, lit up. The clip blew up. #ComLogic trended within hours. Major outlets queued their push notifications. Conversation spilled into living rooms and community halls. Her voice, measured and dignified, traveled faster than the insult intended to silence it. A chorus of muted exhalations rolled through the room, soft admissions, not applause, but a quiet civic recognition that dignity had been affirmed, a small human acknowledgement that something fundamental in public life had been vindicated today. The catharsis was not only for her but for a wider public that craved evidence that dignity could still prevail. The room that had leaned toward dismissal now leaned toward accountability. Admiration rippled from those who had long been told to be quieter, to be smaller, to fit the mold. Instead, they saw a model, quiet strength converting record into rebuttal, experience into moral authority. And in that stunned space, McConnell's attempt at dismissal reframed as an opening. For him, the punch had missed and recoiled. For her, the moment crystallized a larger truth, that measured words, grounded in service and fact, could do what anger could not. They could change the narrative. The silence throbbed with shock. The air seemed to split open. Every syllable landed like a gavel. The silence was broken not by McConnell, but by the tidal wave outside the chamber. Outside the Senate walls, her words were already echoing louder than his insult. Screens flickered with her words, clips looping in living rooms, offices, and cafes. What had begun as a quiet counter in a chamber now erupted across the nation. Social media feeds churned with admiration and disbelief. Commentators paused mid-sentence, rewrote headlines, and struggled to summarize the shift in tone. What was supposed to be a routine dismissal became a viral affirmation of competence, courage, and moral clarity. Within an hour the clip exploded. #Truth overtitles was everywhere. Observers from every walk of life dissected her phrasing, her pauses, her calm authority. Analysts marveled at the strategic restraint that allowed logic and experience to land blows sharper than any scream or retort. Even conservative outlets paused to note the silence McConnell's words had failed to create. The lopsided duel on stage had become an equalizer, one moment capable of reshaping public perception in an instant. The echo traveled far. Across communities who had long been told their voices were secondary, Crockett's poise served as both validation and inspiration. Immigrant families, young professionals, and women of color shared clips, repeating her words as if they were affirmations, proof that intellect and service could pierce the walls of entrenched power. Her calm was contagious, her logic irresistible. Inside the chamber, McConnell's silence was telling. The words that had once struck as final now hung awkwardly, unclaimed. The older senator, so accustomed to shaping the conversation, had been rendered still, watching as a rising figure recast the narrative before him. Every smirk, every gesture of dominance, now seemed dated, almost fragile. Meanwhile, Crockett's profile rose with the speed of a storm. Interviews, editorials, and social feeds painted her not as a challenger, but as a model of dignity in action. People debated not only her policies but her method, the art of responding without yielding to anger, the craft of turning insult into evidence of character. Admiration spread across demographics, spanning traditional supporters, skeptical onlookers, and those who had felt the sting of marginalization themselves. Hope began to swell among viewers. A single exchange, carefully measured, had done what many thought impossible. It shifted public sentiment, validated experience over pedigree, and reminded the nation that civility and reason could still command attention. The debate was no longer merely about a single insult. It was about a broader message. Dignity could carry weight against decades of assumed authority. The narrative shifted in real time. Podcasts dissected her cadence. Community forums analyzed the moral clarity of her response. Teachers shared the clip in classrooms as an example of how truth, preparation, and restraint could triumph over arrogance. For many, the moment became a lodestar, proof that careful, principled resistance was not only possible but impactful. And yet, even amid the viral flurry and endless commentary, the deepest resonance was subtle. The headlines would fade, the hashtags would trend and fade, but something quieter lingered, a sense that courage paired with preparation could alter the course of a conversation, and, perhaps, a culture. But what lingered most was not the headlines, it was the lesson behind the clash. In the end, what remained was not the insult, but the dignity that had silenced it. The noise dissolved into meaning. The room that had trembled under the weight of arrogance now hummed with a quieter truth, that power, when wielded without moral clarity, is fragile. McConnell's words, designed to diminish and dominate, faded in significance against the unyielding poise of a voice grounded in justice. The lesson was unmistakable: authority is transient, but integrity endures. Silence carried the lesson. Crockett's measured response had demonstrated that courage does not always roar. Strength can reside in calm, and confidence need not shout to be heard. Every pause she took, every syllable she placed deliberately, served as proof that reasoned clarity is a weapon against the bluster of entitlement. The chamber itself seemed transformed, as if acknowledging that the balance between ego and principle could indeed tilt toward truth. The weight lifted into light. Observers reflected on what had truly transpired. The clash had been about more than a single exchange. It was a study in contrast: arrogance versus preparation, ego versus experience, dismissal versus dedication. For audiences watching from homes and offices across the nation, it became a lesson in what real leadership looks like: calm in the storm, service as a guide, and the courage to let facts speak louder than intimidation. Admiration grew not only for her intellect but for the moral architecture of her approach. Where others might have retaliated with heat or desperation, she relied on precision, patience, and the steady accumulation of her record. That strategy, painstakingly developed over years of legal and public service, proved that true influence comes not from loud authority but from enduring respect. The echo of her moment resonated beyond politics. Communities long accustomed to being underestimated saw the tangible power of composed resistance. For young leaders, especially women and immigrants, the event became a beacon, proof that they could enter spaces of entrenched power without compromising values, without raising their voices to match the volume of tradition, and still be heard. Pride and hope intertwined in the public consciousness, a reminder that preparation, dignity, and moral courage are forces no insult can diminish. The moral clarity extended even further. History may favor those accustomed to commanding attention, but lasting change is delivered by those who combine knowledge, service, and resolve. Arrogance may grab the moment, but virtue claims the memory. And in the quiet reflection after the storm, the nation glimpsed what it looks like when power is challenged not with fury, but with principle. As the chamber emptied and screens dimmed, one enduring truth remained. The clash had concluded, but its significance lingered. Dignity can disarm, patience can topple bluster, and calm truth can transform even the most entrenched hierarchy. And for those watching, a final call remained. This was more than politics. It was a parable of truth prevailing. The lights dim. The camera pulls back, capturing a chamber now quiet, yet charged with meaning. What unfolded was a dramatization, yes, but one grounded in a universal truth: arrogance may roar, but clarity and dignity endure. Every viewer becomes part of the lesson, a witness to the way patience and principle can recalibrate power. The story lingers, unfinished. It invites reflection, conversation, and action, not in slogans or partisanship, but in recognition that integrity matters, that voices grounded in service can reshape narratives, and that measured truth carries weight beyond the moment. As you watch, consider how these lessons resonate in your own life and community. Share the story, discuss the stakes, and remember that even in arenas dominated by bluster, calm resolve and preparation can leave an imprint that outlasts the noise. And the story continues in the hands of those who choose to remember it.